Start. Thank you everybody for coming. It's really nice to see such a diverse audience in terms of disciplines and faces, and yeah, good, lots of women in the crowd. And I represent Kirsty Pattison. First of all, we are organizing this lecture as part of our research seminar, Religion, Challenge and Change. We are both doing it, Saiko Yasaki and I. Saiko is an expert on Islam and Japanese religions, and South Asian religions, and Kirsty is working with us for the past few years. She's writing her PhD, almost done. Hopefully next time we're going to invite you to a lecture. It's going to be Dr. Pattison. I already want to call her Dr. Pattison because really I learned a lot from her. We work together in the Mysticism and Spirituality class, and every year in the past few years she's been teaching on esotericism and magic and mysticism. Her PhD is on issues related to mysticism in Scotland, right?
Yep.
She actually is very diverse, much more than that in her work. She knows a lot about Jewish mysticism, Christian mysticism beyond the Scottish context. And by now she also knows a lot about South Asia and Japanese religions, and because she's working with us. She also presented in several international conferences related to esotericism and magic in Amsterdam, in Cork, in Ireland. And you can even perhaps find some of her recordings online if you look carefully. And she also published an article in Glasgow University's E-Sharp journal on the boundaries, right, between magic and mysticism. So as you can see, I didn't even have to read her abstract because I really think her work is immensely interesting. The stage is yours, Kirsty, and thank you very much for coming to present.
Thank you for a very kind introduction. Welcome. This paper sort of comes from part of my PhD research, but also part of the wonderful play that Mona Munro has produced outside of her, as part of her James Plays trilogies, which I found quite thought-provoking and ties into some of my ideas within my own work. So I've kind of combined it together for what I'm going to give you today. So today I'm going to present a paper, Forgotten Voices and Hidden Histories, why I think we need to talk about the Renaissance in Scotland. So, during the promotional campaign for the premiere performance of the Scottish playwright Mona Munro's fourth instalment of her James Play series, entitled James IV, Queen of Flight, I witnessed several comments on social media criticising the promotional material, which features two women of colour and an actor playing James IV. The most common comments levied the charge of political correctness gone mad, because for the general public engaging with the posts, people of colour had no place in 16th century Scotland. Munro responded to the comments in an article published in the Guardian newspaper in 2022, stating, quote, "People on social media are saying we're crowbarring it in, but we're really not. The history of Black people in Britain has been largely ignored, marginalised, and made invisible," end quote. Munro's play is a testament to the way in which giving a voice to the marginalised and the forgotten can challenge the traditional way history is viewed. My own PhD research focuses on Scotland between the years of 1430 and 1580, and it centres around what Walter Hanegraaff has called rejected religion. That is, the study of esoteric religious trends that are often syncretic in nature, drawing a range of religions, philosophies, and traditions in a quest to uncover some form of ancient divine wisdom. What Hanegraaff is referring to is traditions and beliefs that have not only been rejected by the established religion in various times and places, but also largely rejected by mainstream academia. To put it another way, esotericism explores the intellectual history of higher forms of magic, which have been categorized in scholarship often as ceremonial or intelligent magic. One of the curious dynamics of this area of study in the Renaissance period across Western and Central Europe is the way in which Christians are engaging with Jewish and Muslim scholarship, as well as looking at the return to philosophical schools of antiquity in an attempt to uncover universal truth. The field of esotericism has only truly come into its own in the last 20 to 30 years. In this paper, I want to explore some of the forgotten voices in Scottish Renaissance and hope to demonstrate that when we start listening to these voices again, it opens up hidden histories that can help us challenge the way in which we view the past and change our understanding of those that came before us. So first, I would like to return to the story of the Moorish lassies. So Munro's play opens, for those who haven't seen it, with the Scots poet William Dunbar at the port of Leith trying to find inspiration for a new poem. While there, he witnesses the arrival of two women of colour. Munro's portrayal of the arrival of the Moorish lassies is based on Dunbar's poem entitled Ain Black Moor, which is believed to have been written around 1507-1508. The play then centres around the experiences of these women as they become part of the court of James IV, weaving historical facts with the artistic license of a playwright. Historical records show that 2 years before the composition of Dunbar's poem in 1505, a Captain William Wadd was paid for a freight of several items from Portugal, which included amongst the items in an entry that simply states, the Moors. Court records show that one of the male Africans in Edinburgh at this time was a drummer and choreographer who used his skills to construct a lavish dance performed on Shrove Tuesday in 1505, with 12 performers in checkered black and white costumes, costing the court £12, 2 shillings and 10 pence. Prior to these events, there is also records that inform us that on the 11th of December in 1504, one of the female Africans president of the court was christened at Stirling. Research undertaken by Harry Hodge for Historic Environment Scotland suggests that the girl that was christened was possibly about 10 years old and that she was one of 2 African girls who served as attendants at the royal court. Records of courtly expenses show that these Moorish lassies were endowed with fashionable attire and played an important role in lavish tournaments held at Holyrood House, one in 1507 and a second in 1508, which Munro incorporates into the play. By 1513, there is evidence to show that trois black ladies were at the court of the king purchasing French crowns for them as a gift. From the records, it's unclear if these were the same women throughout the period or if there were several African women at the court. One of the things that struck me as particularly interesting regarding the role of Africans in the court of James IV is that the main European centres which engaged with this practice at the time are Portugal, Spain, and Italy. Indeed, it should be noted that Africans were not present in the court in England until 1555. My own research focus is to look for ways in which Scotland was engaging with Renaissance continental ideas, and a connection between Portugal and Scotland is an interesting line of inquiry. However, as of yet, I've not been able to find any reference to these connections in secondary literature. There are interesting parallels in the way that Scotland and Portugal identified as nations during this time. In Caitlin's work on the cultural links between Portugal and Italy in the Renaissance period, she acknowledges Portugal's struggle to be viewed separately from their powerful Spanish neighbour, noting that Portuguese national identity suffered as a result of widespread ignorance, as well as at the hands of Spanish propaganda. This certainly feels like a familiar narrative in Scotland's fight to be recognised on its own against the English. But it also opens up questions regarding why Scots were interested in having Moors at the royal court. As I mentioned in my introduction, those engaging in what I have named esoteric Christian humanism were exposed to the ideas of Muslim philosophers such as Al-Kindi, Avicenna, and Averroes. Did exposure to these thinkers pique the interest of the nobility? Particularly when we know from court records that many of the Africans at the court were treated so well. Or were they simply just exotic curiosities of the time? These questions remain unknown. For me, the role of Africans at the court of James IV is an excellent example that highlights the fact that when we give a voice to the forgotten, we uncover hidden histories waiting to be explored. In my research in the Renaissance in Scotland, it's littered with forgotten voices and hidden histories, and this is why I'm going to argue I think we need to talk about the Renaissance in Scotland more. Sorry. It would be helpful to define what is generally meant when we talk about the Renaissance period. The term Renaissance comes from the French, meaning rebirth, and has been used to describe various periods of cultural flowering, but its most notable use is for the period that straddles the late medieval into the early modern period. The term was first used by French historian Jules Michelet in the 19th century in his multi-volume work on the history of France, and he uses it to denote the specific historical period. But for Michelet, the Renaissance was a development in science rather than art and culture. And as a French nationalist, he argued it was specifically a French movement. However, in 1860, the Swiss historian Jacob Burckhardt published his De Culture der Renaissance in Italian, which defined the Renaissance as having its birth in Italy. Burckhardt situated it as the period between the artists Giotto and Michelangelo and regarded it as a launching of a new era of art and culture. According to Burckhardt, the Italian Renaissance also marks a turning point in the human nature when, quote, man became a spiritual individual and recognized himself as such, in the same way the Greeks had once distinguished themselves from the barbarian, end quote. Though Michelet and Burckhardt disagree on the origins of the movement, both men agreed that what they had named the Renaissance marked a watershed moment in the history of humanity, an awakening from its darkness of the Middle Ages. Scholarly debates surrounding what actually identifies the late medieval and early modern Renaissance are ongoing. The notion that the Renaissance is some form of golden age in the cultural development of humanity is a 19th century construction and features heavily in the discourse of the mid-20th century. One of the key identifiers, often synonymous with discussions with the Renaissance period, is the coming of humanism. Paul Oscar Christeller, writing in the 1940s, argues that when it comes to the Renaissance, that humanism was, quote, the most classical and persuasive intellectual current of that period, end quote. This new way of thinking can be seen in art, architecture, politics, sciences, theology, and the literature of the time. The extent to which these Renaissance ideas expand throughout the continent of Europe is again of scholarly debate. In many ways, it might actually be more helpful to think about multiple Renaissances, each of them unique to the country or city-state in which they appear. So similar to my field of esotericism that's about 20 to 30 years old, Andrea Thomas in her chapter on the Scottish Renaissance notes that for a long time it was assumed Scotland didn't participate in the Renaissance, but actually that in the last 20 years this myth is starting to be challenged. Firstly, it should be noted that while Scotland's participation in the Renaissance may have only come to the foreground of academic inquiry in this last 20 years, that's not to say that no research has been carried out prior to that. The humanist movement in Scotland has received considerable attention, most notably with the pioneering work undertaken by John Durkin beginning in the 1960s. Humanist influences have also been explored in the field of Scottish literature, both in Latin poetry of the period, as well as Scotland's vernacular tradition, which includes the poetry of Robert Henryson, Gavin Douglas, and the aforementioned William Dunbar, to name a few. There have also been studies into the material culture, such as the coinage of James III, which is on the slide here, and the architecture of the period. However, for all of the work that's been previously carried out, there are still massive gaps in our understanding. And while there are several reasons why this may be so, I want to highlight two of the issues that I believe are central. The first issue is the problem of primary source materials, particularly the loss of manuscripts and books. Manuscripts and books are vital pieces of the puzzle when we seek to understand certain periods of history. While library catalogues can go some way to helping us identify the possible interests of certain people and institutions, it is often the annotations and marginalia contained within the works that provide the most illuminating information of the way in which the context of these works were being used or understood. Again, the invaluable work of John Duncan, this time with Anthony Ross, in compiling library lists and tracing the location of extant works is a vital lifeline and a starting point for academics working in the late medieval, early modern period in Scotland. Yet, engaging with the library and book culture during this period is problematic. The systematic destruction of Scotland's libraries is an all too familiar feature. From the initial destruction of key centres of learning in the Wars of Independence at the end of the 13th century and the beginning of the 14th century, Scotland's libraries and institutions would face two further key campaigns of cultural cleansing in the 16th century. The first wave of the 16th century cultural cleansing came at the hands of the English, which is most commonly known as the period of the Rough Wooing. The second wave came at the hands of the Protestant reformers. Occasionally, there are also instances of bad luck, such to our very own original University of Glasgow library. It was actually sent to the Scots College in Paris to protect it from reformers, only to sadly be burned to the ground during the French Revolution. However, the works that have survived can still help us understand the forgotten voices of the Renaissance in Scotland. I'd hope this would be bigger, so it's as well. As previously noted, my research focuses on the way in which Scotland engaged with esoteric Christian humanism. The ideas of Marsilio Ficino, the great translator, and the Christian Kabbalist Giovanni Pico della Mirandola and Johannes Reuchlin were the starting point for my search. Fortunately, some of these works survived both the 16th century library purges. The original library of King's College in Aberdeen not only contains the extant copies of Ficino's controversial work, 3 Books on Life, which focuses on the health of the body and the health of the soul, but also a copy of Reuchlin's De Arte Kabbalistica, the first systematic discussion regarding the development of Christian Kabbalah. What makes these books even more interesting is that both works contain extensive marginalia at the hands of their 16th century owners. So image 1 here, there's Hector Boyce's handwriting is the messy one, and the one who's writes slightly neater is the second mediciner Robert Gray, and they annotate throughout. And here we have one of the annotations by the principal Alexander Abanoff. And this symbol here is uniquely Christian Kabbalah. So it features the tetragrammaton, so God's the unpronounceable name, but it's placed into the decad, so Pythagoras, the monad, so it's the perfect number. And being within an equilateral triangle, which comes from Xenocrates, creates this idea that equilateral triangles symbolize divinity, whereas isosceles triangles represent half divinity, and then scaling represent human. So we can see here that we know that they're actually not just reading these books, but he's engaging with the material. And this triangle here is also used as a meditative technique. So we can kind of say there's something going on here for him to have written that in the margin, which is very cool. Also in King's College is the early extant version of the Corpus Hermetica in Scotland, a text translated from the Greek by Ficino, which contains 17 mystical tracts attributed to the Egyptian sage Hermes Trismegistus, who in the 15th century was believed to be a contemporary of the biblical Moses and the Greek Pythagoras. This translation forms part of a compiled book of esoteric Christian humanist texts that belonged to the friend of William Elphinstone, Hector Boyce, King Gavin Dunbar, the canon Alexander Galloway. With the exception of Elphinstone and Boyce, the other owners of the books I've mentioned have received little, and in some instances, to no scholarly attention. And this brings me to my second point. The major issue I have personally encountered is the dominance of Protestant discourse. Of course, since the Reformation in 1560, Scotland has been a Protestant country, with the threat and fear of Catholic revolt never too far away. While I expected scholarship to reflect Scotland's Protestant past, I was surprised to find that so many of my research inquiries involving key figures of the Scottish Church post-1440 and pre-1560 have very little written about them, a frustration often discussed with my very, very patient supervisor. Of course, the lack of research on these figures is in part due to lack of source material, and equally important is that there needs to be scholars interested in these people to carry out the research. However, the period of the Renaissance in Scotland is often only defined in the terms of the coming of the Reformation. In my background reading, in preparation for beginning my PhD, many of the general histories on the late medieval and early modern periods in Scotland focus only on proto-Protestant figures and events. Again, while I understand why this has been the general focus of the Renaissance, it has also been a source of great frustration when trying to gain a balanced view of the history of Scotland and its connections to the wider European world. However, in a very positive light, it does mean that the period is ripe for new and exciting research to be undertaken. And I hope to have shown that the extant material still available to us can yield exciting discoveries. So with this in mind, I would like to take the rest of this paper to discuss a section of my thesis that demonstrates the wealth of interesting material just waiting to be worked on. So the example I would, not done one for that. The example I would like to explore is the treatment of ecumenical councils. So the Council of Basel and the Council of Ferrara-Florence. So the Council of Basel opened on the 23rd of July in 1431. However, the first Scottish delegation did not arrive there until 1434, when the council was beginning to question the authority of the Pope at the time, Pope Eugene. The council is most often approached in scholarship as the struggle between those who supported the conciliarist movement and those that supported the absolute power of the papacy. And it is the legacy of Scotland's positive position on conciliarism that tends to be the focus of Scotland's role at the council, as it foreshadows the coming of Reformation thinking. However, back in Scotland, James I begins to show support for the Pope, and just before his murder in February 1437, James officially reconciles with the Pope. The murder of James I sent the country into turmoil, as his heir, James II, was only 6 years old. Dividing fractions feuding over the succession of James II took opposite sides. Those who supported the succession of James II supported the Pope, in line with the leading monarchs of Europe, while the so-called Baronial faction, led by the Earl of Douglas, continued to support the Council of Basel against Eugene. As tensions at the Council of Basel rose, Eugene decides to transfer the council to Ferrara in the January of 1438, without the authority of the clerics that were attending. Over the course of the entire period of the Council of Basel, a total of 63 named Scottish clerics were in attendance at one time or another. And I must stress, they're not all there at the same time. They are coming in and out throughout the whole kind of 6-year period. Those clerics that refused to accept the return to the papacy and who tried to uphold the decrees of Basel would actually find themselves removed from office to make way for those who attended and accepted the decrees of the Council of Ferrara-Florence. In order to consider the way in which Renaissance ideas could have made their way to Scotland, the Council of Ferrara-Florence is a key moment for the transmission of these ideas, and the council attracted a significant delegation of Scottish clerics, en masse and numbering the same and possibly more than those who attended Basel. As previously noted, Basel was reconvoked in Ferrara in the January of 1438. But due to an outbreak of plague, the council was relocated to Florence that summer. Due to negotiations between the Pope and the Byzantine Empire, a large delegation, estimated, some put it as high as 700 in number, arrived from the Byzantine Empire into Ferrara in April 1438. In attendance with the Byzantine delegation, were two leading proponents of Neoplatonic thought, Georgios Gamestos Plethon and his pupil Basil Bezeron of Trezevon. The move to Florence meant that many of the Florentine humanists were able to take advantage of the situation. Walter Hanegraaff notes that for the Florentine humanists, and in particular Cosimo de' Medici, the powerful banker and politician who established the Medici family as the rulers of Florence for much of the Renaissance, Gamestos Plethon came to symbolize the biblical wise man from the East. Part of the reason for this connection between Plethon and the image of the biblical wise man was Plethon's novel suggestion that the true wisdom originated with Zoroaster, the chief of the Magi, and that he supported this claim with his own commentary on the Chaldean oracles, which Platon argued incorrectly were the words of Zoroaster. For those who may not know, the Chaldean oracles are in fact a collection of philosophical and spiritual tracts attributed to a 2nd century Neoplatonic movement. Not only did Platon falsely attribute the oracles to Zoroaster, but he renamed them, calling them the magical sayings of the Magi, disciples of Zoroaster. Christopher Woodhouse suggests that Platon describes them in these terms, quote, in order to give the oracles the prestige of antiquity combined with Oriental wisdom, end quote. As well as presenting the oracles to those in attendance at the council, Platon and Besron are often cited as figures who reignited an interest in Platonic discourse, giving lectures on Platonic discourse, which allowed the broader Latin West to re-engage with Platonism through the presence of learned Greek scholars. The exact dates of these lectures are unknown. However, Woodhouse does tentatively suggest that evidence points to the lectures occurring in the first half of 1439 and possibly going as late as the summer. It is also unclear who may have attended these lectures. Out with the definitive presence of Cosimo de' Medici, the only other confirmed attendee is the Italian Giorgiano Teferranti, who would go on to become the first teacher of Greek at the University of Paris. While it's difficult to say for sure if any of the Scottish delegation attended any of these lectures, it's not outside the realms of possibility to suggest that some of the Scottish delegation may have engaged in these events. So research on Scotland's presence at the Council of Florence has been extremely limited. Actually, until the publication of Stuart McManus's article, which came out in 2020. Thanks to the work of McManus, I've been able to identify some of the clerics that would have been in attendance during the first half of 1439, when Platon's lectures are believed to have been held. One name of particular significance is that of William Elphinstone Sr., father to Bishop Elphinstone, who I mentioned earlier, and founder of King's College in Aberdeen, which, as I've previously shown you, has a vast collection of esoteric Christian humanist texts. Also in attendance was our very own William Turnbull, the future Bishop of Glasgow and founder of Glasgow University, to whom, keep in your mind, we will circle back to later. While it's difficult to assess the full extent of the influence the Council of Florence had on the intellectual history of Scotland, it is possible to suggest that some of these ideas may have made it back, and if they did, might it be possible to find their footprints in some unlikely places? As part of another strand of my research, I began engaging with the chronicles of Scotland, particularly those written in the 15th and 16th century, focusing on the origin myth of the people of Scotland, which I'll give you some background to. So the Scottish Wars of Independence marked an important epoch in the writing of Scottish chronicles. The death of King Alexander III in 1286 and the subsequent death of his only surviving heir, his granddaughter Margaret, in 1290, caused a power vacuum in Scotland. Fearing civil war, England's Edward I was asked by the Guardians of Scotland to travel to Scotland to act as an arbitrator between the claimants. Seizing the opportunity created by the succession dispute, Edward invades Scotland, and by March 1296, invades in March 1296, and by August that same year, Scotland was under English control. And the determination by the Scottish Church to protect itself from any claim by the Church in England, Scotland's bishops appealed to the papacy for support. Despite the support of the Pope, Boniface VIII at this time, Edward continued his campaign. In the spring of 1299, a mission was sent to Rome on behalf of the Guardians of Scotland to ask Boniface to enforce the fact that Scotland was the direct subject of the papacy and to use this power to force Edward out of Scotland. The mission was a success, and on the 27th of June, 1299, the Pope issues a bull to Edward stating that England had no right to the claim of Scotland and that he should remove all representatives and officials from Scotland henceforth. It would take Edward a year to reply to the Pope's request, But Edward's reply to the Pope would actually shape the way in which Scotland set out to conceive of its own history. Edward's lengthy response to the Pope was issued in 1301 and set out arguments for England's rightful claim to the throne. Central to his argument is the use of the Brutus legend, through which Edward hoped to demonstrate that the Kingdom of Scotland has always been under the control of Britain. The letter explains that after the death of Brutus, a Trojan lord of renown of the blood of Aeneas, the lands of England, Scotland, and Wales were left to his sons, Lochran, Albany, and Camber, respectively. When Albion was slayed by Humbert, the king of the Huns, all Albanian possession reverts back to the rights of Lochran, to his heirs. Edward cites the law of Troy, in which he claims that the land of Scotland was merely held in homage and service, but that it always reverts back to the crown of England. The letter even details the rule of King Arthur, in which it tells of Arthur's destruction of Albany due to the rebellion, which Arthur, quote, gave Scotland to Sir Anglesey, and Sir Anglesey carried Arthur's sword, end quote. Since that time to the present, the kings of Scotland have all been subject to the King of Britain. Sorry, that's where I should have ended the quote. The key source for much of Edward's letter is the Historia Regum Britannia, written in 1163 by Geoffrey of Mormont, which ironically was constructed as a political tool to argue for their own succession issues in the 12th century. The political use of myth would continue to be pursued in England's claim over Scotland until the unification of crowns of James VI and James I in 1603. Colin Kidd and James Coleman contend the history of the mythical Scotland is not a singular depiction of a national mindset, but is best negotiated by way of overlapping phrases of myth-making. In response to the continuous threat of the English crown, based in a large part to Mormont's Historia, late medieval Scottish clerics began espousing their own national mythology, which reinforced the autonomy of the Scottish crown and the nation of Scotland. According to the Scottish narrative, Scotland was found earlier than its English counterpart by, I'm going to get this wrong, Gathias and Scotia, descendants actually from Egypt and Greece, and Egypt in the time of Moses. The chronicle of most interest to the discussion now is the Scotochronicon. So the Scotochronicon was written by the Augustinian Abbot Walter Bower, who was based at Inchcolm Abbey, situated in the Firth of Forth, close to Edinburgh. There you go, that's a lovely picture of it. Close to Edinburgh. Bower's chronicle greatly expands on the 14th century 5-volume chronicle written by John of Verdun. Bower tells his readers that he was approached by Sir David Stewart of Rosyth to complete an up-to-date edition of Verdun's work. The Scotochronicon, produced by Bower, contains 16 volumes in total. Book 1 of the Scotochronicon is dedicated to the foundation of Scotland, to the story of Gaethlas, Scotia, and their kin. In chapters 8 and 9 of Book 1, Bower has added a history of the world using the doctrine of the 6 ages as his guide, this placing Scotland in the wider context of the known world, which I would actually argue is an identifier of the Renaissance spirit, as Scotland is seeing itself in the larger context. Now, Bower's source is likely to be the etymologies of Isildur of Seville, as there are close parallels between the two texts. One of the places in which Bower chooses to expand on Isildur's text is with regards to Zoroaster. Isildur simply states, quote, Zoroaster invented magic, end quote. Bower chooses to expand on the entry to Zoroaster, stating, quote, Zoroaster discovered the art of magic. Solinus, in his book on the Wonders of the World, Book 2, Chapter 8, writes about Zoroaster that contrary to the course of nature, as soon as he emerged from his mother's womb, he emitted a deep laugh, whereas all others born are born weeping, end quote. The story of Zoroaster's unusual birth narrative is also found in Augustine's City of God, a source which Bower seems to also have access to due to other sort of parallels within his writing. In Augustine's telling of the Zoroaster narrative, he tells us that Zoroaster was not only a human to be born, was the only human to be born smiling, and that this unique birth was a portent to his engagement in harmful magical acts. So why did Bauer add this interesting passage regarding Zoroaster when the vast majority of his borrowings from Isidore of Seville are identical and without addition? We know from records that Bauer did not attend the Council of Ferrara of Florence, nor did he actually travel anywhere outside of Scotland to consult with sources to write his chronicle. However, as previously noted, he was a member of an Augustinian house, and Donald Watt, one of the only scholars who's worked extensively translating the Scotochronicon into English, notes that Augustinian houses were subject to annual visitations by the diocese bishop, which was the Bishop of Dunkeld. You may have noticed from the slide earlier, James Kennedy, who attended the Council of Florence, held the bishopric of Dunkeld from 1437 to 1440, where he was transferred to the bishopric of Andrews while at Florence. Watt has convincingly shown that the library at St Andrews was one visited by Bauer. Another connection to the Council of Florence and Bauer is found in our University of Glasgow founder, William Turnbull. Turnbull actually may have been better positioned to interact with Bauer on several occasions during the writing of his Scotochronicon, which was between 1441 and 1447. Turnbull held two important positions at the court of James II, being appointed the King's Secretary of State in 1441, and a responsibility he combined with the Privy Seal. As well as his positions at court, Turnbull was an effective assistant to Kennedy, who placed Turnbull at the vicarage in Edinburgh in 1444. Watt also notes that Inchcomb's proximity to Edinburgh means that Bauer is recorded as having sporadic involvement with the court and parliament during this time, while he was compiling the chronicle. This made me interested to see if I could find any connection between Turnbull and Inchcombe. And lo and behold, while I was looking at the charters of Inchcombe, I was able to find an entry dated 8th of June 1441, which places William Turnbull in his position as Keeper of Privy Seal as witness to said charter at Inchcombe in the presence of Bauer. The connection between Bauer and the two attendees of Florence, Kennedy and Turnbull, may explain why he felt the need to add this little detail about Zoroaster to his work. Bauer's addition certainly feels like a warning or a reminder that Zoroaster's engagement with magic was believed to be his downfall. Might it be that Turnbull and Kennedy in conversation recounted the claims of Clepon they heard while in Florence, and Bauer felt compelled to place a warning in his work to ensure and remind the faithful of the harm in learning such magical acts. Scholarship exploring the significance of Bauer's Scotochronicon on Scotland's intellectual elite is in its infancy. The work by Watt has been invaluable to my own research. However, the notes included in this excellent translation require much deeper academic assessment and consideration. The Scotochronicon is mentioned in the vast majority of scholarship on the 15th century in Scotland, yet it has never been the focus of an in-depth critical study. My own research has so far only been able to evaluate one line of inquiry in the first book, and the outcomes have been illuminating, to say the least. Chronicles act as a source of political propaganda, but they could also tell us a lot about how a country wants to view itself and how they want to be seen by the wider world. The fact that Bauer is situating Scotland in the landscape of a wider history points to humanist ideals. For me, this begs the question, what else can the Scotochronicon tell us about Scotland's relationship to European Renaissance ideas? The fact that Bauer appears to be given a warning to his readings regarding the nature of Zoroaster also helps us understand the reception of these ideas, as a more detailed analysis of the work could illuminate Bauer, or perhaps even the wider Scottish elite's position on a number of ideas and historical events. To me, the Scotochronicon feels like a wealth of information ready to be unlocked and give a voice to some of Scotland's forgotten voices and illuminate some of our hidden histories. So to conclude, I hope to have shown throughout this paper that by listening to the voices of the forgotten or the marginalized, we can uncover hidden histories that help us uncover aspects about our past. The Scottish Renaissance period has many hidden stories to tell us, and this is why I believe that we need to start talking about the Renaissance in Scotland. Thank you.
Thank you so much. That was great. I hope you have questions.